We talked about forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. Sometimes in the operation of a team, especially when you're going through the storming period, there's some things that we should be aware of. The one is what we'll call social loafing. And that's essentially when someone puts less effort in a task when they're working with a group than they do when they work alone. So they sort of are going to loaf and just let other people pick up the slack. Okay, so you do want to prevent that. And one of the things that can do to prevent that is make sure there's clear roles established and norms established so that each individual on the team is aware of what is expected of them. And the task specialist keeps the team moving towards the goal, and the team maintenance specialist creates and maintains time, calm, hurry. So it's really how making sure that we've defined out the roles, and these specialists keep us on track, and the maintenance people focus on the process itself. So we need to be cautious of social loafing. Next thing, and we've talked about this before, is group think. And that occurs when not everybody has the same perspective, okay? And we don't consider all the alternatives, and we value everybody agreeing rather than quality decisions. Sometimes working through to a quality decision is about thinking differently broadly. We did that when we went to look at the many uses for a magic marker cap. And when you have people together and they tend to be from the same background, same experiences, the risk is groupthink. Everybody thinks it's a great idea. And sometimes we can have a very persuasive individual in a group who can help convince people of something. And that contributes to groupthink. Okay? To work on that, again, establish performance norms. So those are two things to be looking at, to be aware of when we want to have an effective group. The next piece is there's certain dysfunctions, and let's go through them. One is the lack of trust, and people don't feel safe to say, oh, I made a mistake, share their concerns, express their ideas or feelings. Fear of conflict. A lot of people don't like conflict. I don't always like conflict. I want everything to be all right. So sometimes you might, and sometimes I do, I go along with others simply to keep the peace, to keep harmony. And I'm not going to raise conflicting opinions. Now we've seen, unfortunately, in the past 2 months, we've seen people expressing conflicting opinions, and then there's been a visceral reaction to that. Lack of commitment. We really don't care. They can't commit to the decisions and the subsequent implementation because they haven't contributed their true opinions and ideas. Avoidance of accountability. I don't want to be held responsible for that. And you finger point. Inattention to results. Put the needs of the individual ahead. So these are some very common dysfunctions in teams. How can we work around that? Is by taking small gains by people working together. And when a team is working together, they perform worse than the individual members. We need to go back and look at that. Now, the next one is really talking about what consensus is. And consensus is sometimes misunderstood. And let me put some things out there about what it's not. It's not a majority vote. Consensus is not having 3/4 of the people agree. It's not about reaching a compromise, because when you say compromise, that means somebody is giving and somebody is taking. That's not consensus. It's not about win-win or lose-win or lose-lose, because as soon as we talk about things like win-win, we're implying a score and something being better than something else. I'd suggest to you that true consensus is when everyone on a team can answer the following question in the affirmative. although I may not agree with the outcome, I support it because it was reached openly and fairly, and I believe my point of view was understood. It may not be my first choice, but I will support it because how it was reached. So consensus isn't not a majority. It's not a compromise. It's not a win-win. It's not a lose-win or win-lose. It's about being able to answer the question. Although I may not agree with it, I can support it because it was reached openly and fairly, and I believe that my point of view was understood. So I think that becomes a very important part, is that in teamwork, that when you do come up with a decision, or even when you're defining the process, that be defined and consensus be reached. Now, let's, why does this do this? Building effective teams. There's a couple of things that need to be present, some competencies within the team from a process perspective. The ability to resolve conflicts, and that can include the ability to recognize and encourage desirable and discourage undesirable team conflict. But to recognize the type and the source of conflict, confronting the team, and implement an appropriate resolution strategy. Next one is we have collaborative problem-solving abilities, the ability to identify situations requiring participative group problem-solving, and the proper degree and type of participation. The ability to recognize some of the obstacles. There we go, that's back. Communication abilities, communicate openly and supportively, to listen. Notice we went through that. The ability to listen was one of the skills you looked at. That becomes part of that. Goal setting and self-management. How does it monitor its own performance? Planning and task coordination abilities. Team contract. Okay, and that's a written agreement between team members that establish ground rules, also known as norms, roles, and accountabilities. So those are the things that we have. These are all important things when you need these competencies, skills in it. And at times, we look at this, and there are ethical behaviors that come to play in teams. 4 important ones are: how do teams fairly distribute work? How do teams assign blame and award credit? So should we really look at blame, or should we really focus on how does the team be successful overall? How do teams ensure participation, that everybody will do their work, resolve conflict, make decisions? And then how do teams avoid deception and corruption? Good question today for us to look like. Yes, there is going to be conflict. I think if we didn't say there'd be conflict, we wouldn't have any storming. And even when you're into the norming part, there's going to be conflict. And when we look at conflict, it takes on a negative connotation. Okay? And that's when one party attempts to thwart the intentions or goals of another. And there's type of conflict. And we're looking at this in a negative point. And I don't particularly like that. But task, there's disagreement among people about the goals to be achieved or the tasks needed. So you want to, the most important thing with this is to break down the type of conflict to say, is it about what we're dealing with, the task, or is it about the personal behaviors, the relationship, the ability of the individuals to get along that creates the tension? Is it personal? Okay? So you want to discern, is this a fact-based, task-based thing, or is it about the person? Okay? Because when you have conflict, it's much easier to deal with task conflict than it is a personal conflict between two people. We could spend a whole semester studying that. So there's different ways of handling conflict, and it's interesting. Compromise is halfway. In there, nobody wins, nobody loses. So this is probably, when you come back to consensus, compromising is halfway. But yet, it can be avoiding, no way, dominating, my way, accommodating, your way, and collaborating, our way. And we'd like to resolve it for the most part here because you have assertive and cooperative. Okay? Assertive doesn't necessarily mean doing it my way, but it's making sure your point is understood within the context of reaching consensus and not coming back to, okay, I'm just going to avoid this, I'll be quiet, you can do it your way, I really don't care. Or you can get into the dominating. And sometimes this is how it comes across, is the communication. And oftentimes when it really is about task, it comes across much stronger as a relationship. So when you see, you need a moderate amount of conflict, but if you have too low of contact and too low of team participation, performance is low. Conversely, the moderate amount probably produces the highest level because the conflict means things are being discussed. High level of conflict, nothing is getting done. And that's when it moves off tasks. So when we look at this is more about relationships here than it is about task. So you really want to have a little bit of conflict where we can look at different points of view to make sure everything is getting out on the table. When we do look at conflict management skills, if you will, and this isn't consensus. This is how do you negotiate. The difference between reaching consensus on something and negotiating an outcome. Okay, you engage in give and take discussions. Consider various alternatives to reach a joint decision. Again, sometimes if you get that middle one, you're just not going to have the level of performance. Some of the guidelines, most important, separate the people from the problem. Okay? That is the hardest thing, because most of the time it's not the people, it's the problem. Okay? And people sometimes have very strong roles. I come back to listening skills. Focus on the underlying interest, not what the current demands are. Demands, oftentimes if you say it's a yes or no obstacle, that can be an ineffective way to negotiate. Okay? Underlying interest, problems that can be solved creatively. Listening and asking questions. Okay? Keep coming back that results are based on objective standards. And we maybe take a look at this on Tuesday.